will be discussed by myself, Aleksandar Metulev, and as well as Morgan McVey, who will come on at a later point. Now, let's jump straight into compliance audits. We'll go over a few things in this presentation. The first of all being regulatory requirements, what are the requirements of a compliance audit, what the compliance audit timeline is, preparation, implementation, finalization, what some common deficiencies are, some tips for streamlining, and then interview techniques and tips. Now, why do we do a compliance audit? Well, the biggest reason is it is required by regulations. In California, by CalARP, California External Release Prevention Programs, it is required for both Program 2 and Program 3 facilities. Then we also have the EPA Risk Management Plan program and the OSHA PSM programs. These all require that you audit your prevention program elements at least every 3 years. The CalARP RMP PSM compliance audit requirements are nearly identical. You must certify evaluation of compliance at least every 3 years. If you've been doing the PSM RMP programs since its initiation in 1999, you should be coming up on your next compliance audit in 2017. And this is an especially important time to do your compliance audits because the EPA is starting an enforcement initiative in October 1st of this year. Now that's in just a week from now, they will be starting their enforcement initiative on the risk management plan. Chances are your facility is going to get audited by the EPA in the next 3 years. So compliance audits are more important now than they have been in the past. In essence, a compliance audit is just that. It's make sure that when the EPA comes in and audits your program, the amount of deficiencies they find is very low. You want to find those deficiencies before they do and fix them. For a compliance audit, you need at least one person that's knowledgeable in the process. You need one person that's knowledgeable in the regulations. They'll be if the person is knowledgeable in the regulations offhand, it makes it a lot easier and a lot more efficient to do the compliance audit. If you know what you're looking for, if you've done this multiple times, you can more easily determine whether a facility is compliant or not. And it's also very important that you document any findings that you find and record any recommendations that are made. And also, as part of this, you must retain your last 2 most recent compliance audits. Now, one thing you should do is go back to those 2 most recent compliance audits and make sure that any of the recommendations on those compliance audits have been properly closed out. Now, there's multiple elements that are associated with a CalARP RMP PSM program. You have the submittal, the management program, the hazard assessment, the prevention program, and the emergency response program. Now, the compliance audit, by regulations, only affects the prevention program. Now, you don't have to look at your hazard assessment, your management program, your submittal. However, I would recommend doing it. When the EPA comes in, they're not just going to look at your prevention program elements. They're going to look at your submittal. They're going to look at your hazard assessment. They're going to look at your management program. Now, while you may not be required by regulations to look at any of those, I would severely recommend that they are looked at any compliance audit that you do. This is a nice little table that kind of goes over the different program elements for RMP, PSM, and CalARP, and it shows where compliance audit stands, which is highlighted there in red. As you can see, it's required across the whole spectrum. The programs are pretty much identical, CalARP, EPA, OSHA, and they all require a compliance audit. Now, let's go over a compliance audit timeline. to go over preparation, implementation, and finalization. Now, out of these elements, the preparation part is key in making a very efficient compliance audit. You must, before you even start the compliance audit, there must be a plan. There must be an agenda and a schedule, and this agenda must be shared with everyone that will be involved in the compliance audit ahead of time. And I mean well ahead of time. At least I would recommend at least a week before to plan ahead for the compliance audit. Not everyone in the team is required to be there at all times during compliance audit. A lot of the time, it's just going to be the auditor going over documentation. Now, there's requirements for interviews. There's requirements for certain people to be there depending on the organization. Some organizations have dedicated maintenance departments, dedicated training departments that may have records that are needed for the compliance audit. So scheduling those appropriately throughout the compliance audit rather than just having the whole team present throughout the compliance audit will save a lot of time for the people involved. And then you, if it's possible, you want to send a digital version of your program to your auditor. If the auditor can take a look at your program ahead of time, just a brief overview, it makes it a lot easier to navigate once they get on site. Then you just, it's known as a preliminary review of the prevention program elements. Now, implementation. You want to utilize a sign-in sheet and conduct a coordination meeting. Now, I personally like to do the coordination meeting ahead at the beginning of each compliance audit. It's because you want everyone to understand why you do the compliance audit, what's going to be involved in the compliance audit, and what the timeline of the compliance audit is going to be. Like I mentioned previously, you don't need everyone during the whole compliance audit. The majority of the time is just the auditor looking through documentation. That's another thing. You must it's very important that you have all documentation assembled before the compliance audit and then put it in one place. If you have to go look for documentation during the compliance audit, it's just going to be a big waste of time. Then also, as part of the compliance audit, you should also do a walk down of your covered process. Now we'll go over some time-saving tips for walkdowns and the such in a bit, and then utilize a method to document compliance audit results. If you have a check sheet that basically goes through your program and just kind of checks off things that are regulatory required that are there and present, it makes it a lot easier to conduct a compliance audit. And then after this, you do a documentation review, you do interviews with personnel. Like I said, you schedule those interviews ahead of time just to make sure that everyone's time is not wasted. And then you make notes of field observation. Now, for time saving, we'll go over this in more detail, but you don't want to look into all your operating procedures. You don't want to look into all your maintenance records. You don't want to look into all your training records. You don't want to walk down your whole PNID. If anything, that'll take weeks to finish in some cases, depending on the size of the facility. PSM, there's a PSM guidance that recommends you just do a small portion, do a sample size. Let's say 10% of all of the PNID, 10% of operating procedures, 10% of maintenance records. And you assume, if those are correct, that it's a representative sample of what your whole program is. And it's very important that this be done at random. You don't just pick the best records that you have and you give it to your auditors. Your compliance auditor is there to help you. They're not going to fine you. They're not going to give you a notice of violation. They're going to help you prevent that from occurring when the EPA, or if you're in California, the CUPA comes in to inspect you. So it's very important that you're upfront and you tell everything to your auditor, because it's only going to help you. It's not going to hurt you. After all this is reviewed, you conduct a closeout meeting, and this is a very important part, and we'll go over why and towards the end of this presentation. Now, coordination meeting. Like I said, have an agenda and send it ahead of time. During the meeting, you explain the purpose of the compliance audit. It's important that people understand why you're there and why you're doing a compliance audit. You're there to help them prevent getting to prevent a fine from the EPA, to prevent a notice of violation from the EPA or OSHA or a CUPA if you're in California. You explain, you have an agenda and you have a timeline of what you're gonna review and when. It's important that you stay on schedule and you have a schedule and you stay on it. And then you identify who the key personnel during a compliance audit are. You need a person that's knowledgeable in the process, and you need a person knowledgeable in the regulation and the requirements. You also need a person that's there operate the system at all points of time. And this should be done randomly. You don't want to pick your best operator, because if EPA comes in, they're not going to interview your best operator. They're going to want to interview a person at random. So you pick a person at random. Whoever happens to be there that day should be fine. And then if you have an individual that's one single individual that is in charge of your PSM RMP CALR program, it's important that that person be there as well. Because that person is going to be responsible for fixing any deficiencies found in the compliance audit. And then any individuals that are, if you have individuals that are specific to the program elements, such as training or maintenance, they should probably be there for the coordination meeting as well. Like I said, not everyone needs to be there for the entirety of the compliance audit. It's probably better just to have the coordination meeting and schedule interview times with each individual. And to do this, the best idea that I've seen is if you use a compliance audit checklist. Using a compliance audit checklist, that it doesn't have to be a complicated checklist. Anything that just lists the regulations with a little check mark next to it should be fine to verify regulatory requirements are addressed. It's a very efficient method for documenting a compliance audit, and allows for easy recommendation follow-up. This is a compliance audit checklist that we commonly use here, but you can develop your own. It's just a matter of copying the regulations onto a checklist. It shouldn't be too difficult. Now, as you can see, it has this checklist has the actual regulatory references on the side. It recaps the actual regulation being evaluated. It lists any comments that you may have about how the facility meets that requirement, and how the recommendation, if there's any recommendation, what the recommendation may be. Now, you can also use this checklist when the EPA wants to come in and audit you. They ask you where these elements are, and if you have in the comments the exact location of that for compliance of that specific portion, you can just use that comment to backtrack and find where that documentation is. The more detail you have in the comment section, the better it is. And then as part of this, you just review all prevention program elements, which includes any supporting documentation. And we'll go over in detail what that is in a bit. Now, some best practices for compliance audits. Compliance audits should not only determine if you meet regulatory requirements, but you also address the effectiveness of the program. Now, having a program binder does not mean you're compliant with the regulations. This is a living program. There are forms and records that must be kept throughout the duration of your facility that are included in this program. What this means is that just because you've developed a program in the beginning doesn't mean you're going to be compliant during compliance or during an audit. Now, recommendation versus suggestions. Recommendations are something that you will have to follow through. So my recommendation on recommendations is that the recommendation should only be about items that are compliance deficient. And suggestions are things that might make your life easier, but are not necessarily regulatory required. These can be things like if your program is messy and it takes a while for a regulator to find anything in your program, stuff like making it more organized, that would be a suggestion versus a recommendation. If you don't have maintenance records, now that's a recommendation that needs to be fixed. It's very important that you also have recommendation tracking and follow through. If a regulator asks have you closed any compliance audit recommendations, you must have documentation with closure comments. And this is a very common deficiencies in programs that I see is people have recommendations, they close them out, and then they never follow through on the action tracking log. And then you also must retain all records. This for best practice. Now I'll turn it over to Morgan McVey, who will go over specific program elements and what to do regarding those program elements during a compliance audit. Morgan?
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the common elements within the compliance audit that should be looked at. The first one is for process safety information. There's three main elements here. Information pertaining to the hazards of the regulated substance. So for this, you can look for the SDS for the covered chemical. And so also ensure that the MSDS has been converted to an SDS. The Hazards Communication Standard in 2012 requires that the MSDS be updated to an SDS. The information contained in the SDS is largely the same as the MSDS. However, the SDSs are required to be presented in a consistent, user-friendly 16 format section way. So that's the preferred method now and also required. The next one is information pertaining to the technology of the process. So this includes the overview of the process, which is the block flow diagram. It includes the max intended inventory calculations. It includes safe operating limits and consequences of deviation. So the last section for the process safety information is information pertaining to the equipment in the process. This includes piping and instrumentation diagrams. Also, when you're reviewing these, ensure that the updates have been captured and that they're up to date as most as possible. So make sure that the materials of construction, the electrical classification, the design codes and standards are all within the process safety information as well, including calculations or explanation of relief system design and ventilation system design, and safety systems. The equipment should comply with recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. The process safety information should be accessible to all employees who perform duties in or near the process. So for some time-saving techniques for checking the PSI section, you have to walk down the P&IDs during the compliance audit, but as Alex was saying, you can pick a representative portion of the system and verify that the P&IDs are accurate there, and then you can determine compliance based on that representative section. So the next section that should be reviewed is the process hazard analysis. So a PHA should be completed. Common methodologies are the what-if checklist, or HAZOP. The PHA should also cover facility siting, human factors, external events, and review any previous incidents at the facility as well. And in California, seismic assessment should also be completed. So the appropriate methodology and team members should be present for the process hazard analysis. The team should be knowledgeable in engineering and process operations, and it must include at least one operating employee who has experience and knowledge specific to the process being evaluated, and at least one member who is knowledgeable in the specific process hazard analysis methodology being used. Furthermore, for the recommendations that come out of the PHA, for California, you have 2.5 years to close those out. To make sure that the recommendations are closed out, ensure that there is an established system in place to promptly address the team findings and recommendations, and that closure statements include documentations of actions to be taken to implement the team's recommendations. And then the PHAs should be revalidated on a 5-year time frame. Next section is operating procedures. Operating procedures should include steps for each operating phase as required by the regulations. This includes startup, normal operation, temporary operations as applicable, emergency operations, normal shutdown, and startup following a turnaround. The operating procedures should be synchronized with operating actions in the field. The only way to review this is to complete an operator interview. And that way you can ensure that the operating procedures are the same as what's actually happening at the facility. The operating procedures should also be reviewed annually. There's a certification sheet that you have to sign annually saying that the operating procedures are up to date, and that is what's being followed at the facility. Furthermore, the operating procedures should also be readily accessible to all personnel who work in or near the process area. So for some time-saving techniques for checking the operating procedures during the compliance audit, you have to pick a procedure at random and evaluate for compliance. There's not going to be enough time to go through all the procedures, so just pick one, ask the operator how they do it, ensure that the two are synchronized. And then from that, you can assume that procedure is representative of all. The next section is training. So you have to ensure that there's a training program in place. There's initial and refresher training should occur every 3 years. So to verify that that's happening, you have to ask for a list of employees and verify the training records. There should be training certification records indicating who is trained, the date of the training, signatures of the individuals administering the training, and what they were trained of. Furthermore, a testing procedure should be established to ensure training comprehension. The training must be on operations of the process and must include a method of verification of understanding. The next section is mechanical integrity, preventative maintenance program. It includes that all equipment for the regulated process, there should be a formal schedule established for each maintenance task, means to document the maintenance being completed according to a schedule, and a method to note and correct equipment deficiencies in a timely manner. The inspections and testing procedures shall follow recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. The frequency of inspections and tests shall be consistent with applicable manufacturer recommendations and good engineering practices, and more frequently if determined necessary as dictated by operating history. So for mechanical integrity, time-saving tips. Most facilities use a PM program, so you just have to pick one piece of equipment and ask them to print out all the PMs over the last 5 years. There should be a list of PMs and required frequencies available, so just ensure that that required frequency list for that specific equipment that you're checking is the same as the records that you're provided and that they all match. Also ensure that there's documentation for all PMs performed by contractors. The next section is management of change. So have there been any changes to the covered process? If there have been changes, ensure that the management of all the elements of the management of change have been completed, including training. So you have to check the MOC documentation. MOCs are required for changes that are not a replacement in kind. MOC procedures shall include the technical basis for the proposed change, the impact of the change on safety and health, modifications to operating procedures, necessary time period for the change, and the authorization of the proposed change. So the next section is pre-startup safety review. If there have been any major modifications to the regulated process or to the new regulated process is being constructed, was a PSSR completed? So to check for this, you have to look for the PSSR records and verify training records as well. If no MOCs have been completed, is there a procedure to complete the PSSR? These are questions that should be asked during the audit. Ensure the PSSR involves employees with expertise in process operations and engineering. Compliance audits. Compliance audit report has to be done, and they have to be completed every 3 years. And this is just an internal way to make sure and verify that all of the elements and the program is being followed out as it should be. And it should also list the participants. And then again, recommendations could be created from the compliance audit, and they should be closed out within 1.5 years here in California. The next section is incident investigation. So you have to verify that a procedure exists for incident investigations and that there's a requirement to initiate investigations within 48 hours. Ensure that there's proper team members within the incident investigation team, development of the report, and communication to affected personnel. So if there's been an incident, look for the incident report and know that they must be retained for 5 years. Next section is employee participation. There should be a written plan for employee participation. Employees should also have access to the CalARP PSM RMP program information. To verify this, you can interview operators. Hot work permit. Ensure that there's a procedure to ensure hot work permits. Make sure that the hot work permits are being maintained on file, and you can just verify that they're there and do a quick check on that. Last section is contractors. So ensure that there's a policy to evaluate contractor records. Contractors that are being used on or near the regulated process. So you have to look for all the contract records, make sure that they're being evaluated, and make sure that they're evaluated prior to hiring and evaluated after. So now I'll have Alex come back up, and he'll talk about the finalization and the closeout meeting.
Thank you, Morgan. That was a very good overview of what each program element, what will be looked for each program element during a compliance audit. Now, after you go through this whole ordeal of looking through your whole program, looking through all your records, doing all your interviews, it is very important that you have a closeout meeting. And this closeout meeting should include anyone that will be involved in closing any deficiencies. It's a very good idea to just go over anything that could have come up during the compliance audit. You can brainstorm on how to improve the program, and then, if appropriate and possible, you assign the recommendations right then and there to individuals, and then would include the target completion dates. You have a good schedule in place. This shouldn't be a very big issue to solve any deficiencies in the program. Now, the recommendations. As deficiencies are found, you should really make a recommendation. Following the compliance audit, the recommendation should be followed up and closed out. Now, like I mentioned before, a very common deficiency is not writing closure comments on action tracking logs. People are very good, I found, very good about closing any recommendation, any action items. But very, very often, they don't do the documentation. Now, I know it's not the most glamorous thing to document recommendation closures. You might think, hey, this was closed. It's not a big deal if I don't write the closure comments and this documentation, but everything has been finished, the program is fine. But what if you leave? What if you leave and then someone else has to come in and look at the program? How are they going to know that this has been completed? It's very important that you have a clear documentation and clear comments for everything that you do. You're not the only person that's going to be working on this. This is a program that involves multiple people. Everyone has to be informed of what's going to happen. And ultimately, if you don't have closure comments, you could get a notice of violation by the EPA or whoever audits your program. Now, this is what a sample action tracking log looks like. It has the action ID, what the recommendations are, and like I mentioned, if you see the blank part, it's a good example of what not to do. You have a closed recommendation with no comments of how it was closed or what was done. So it's very important that you put closure comments to any recommendations, even if it's as simple as this person did it, it's done. It doesn't have to be in too much detail, but the more detail you put in, it's obviously going to be better for future individuals that are reviewing the documentation. Now, some common deficiencies and misconceptions. Program documentation versus implementation. I've mentioned this before. Just because you have documentation does not mean you're compliant with the regulations. It's a living program. It has living elements that need to be updated constantly. And this is exactly what you look for in a compliance audit, especially in the mechanical integrity documentation. Now, I know a lot of you are probably going to be using a PM program to maintain your mechanical integrity. But it's a very good idea to have a list of all your PMs in one place. Have an Excel sheet, have a Word document that lists each equipment and lists what the PM is. This will make it a lot easier for whoever comes in to kind of check off, okay, this mechanical integrity, this PM has been done, this inspection has been performed, everything is done. Same thing with the training records. Have a list of the training records, a tracking document that tracks when people need to be trained, when refresher training is due, and kind of lists who's been trained and what's been used to verify that they know material in the training. If you have everything in one place, it makes it a lot easier to review. Operating procedure accuracy. You walk down the procedure with the operator. Just because you have an operating procedure doesn't mean it's a very good operating procedure. It should be walked down with the operator to make sure that this is exactly what the operator does. If an operator does something completely different than what's written on the operating procedure, that's a very common deficiency. P&ID accuracy. A lot of the time, P&IDs are done as built when you open a facility, but as you do changes in the facility, as it's common in many facilities across the spectrum, P&IDs are probably the last thing that gets updated. And this is important that it gets updated because it's a representation of your system. And it's a very common deficiency. I very rarely go to a facility, walk down a system, and don't find something that's missing from the P&IDs, or something that's on the P&IDs and you can't really find in the field. Same thing with the PSI information. PSI information is done when you implement the program in the beginning, but then as you update things throughout, PSI is not updated. A lot of the times facilities age with time. Set points on equipment tend to drop because of the age of the equipment. You can't run and the pressure is as high as you once did. You can't run flows as high as you once did, so you change them. But that information is very often not changed in the PSI information. Furthermore, when you do PHA revalidations, people just say, has anything changed? No, we're done. And it takes 50 minutes. Well, that's not how a revalidation should go. Revalidation should go. You should go through each line item on the process hazard analysis to make sure that the opinion of the people in the new team 5 years later are the same as what was done 5 years ago. And then you have to make sure that you close your recommendation. And not just close them, you also follow through with the documentation. Recommendation follow-up. You assign an individual responsible for following up on the recommendation. You assign an anticipated date of completion, and you document the actions. This is the same thing I've been mentioning throughout the webinar. It's important that you have closure comments on recommendations. If you have a centralized tracking system for recommendation, that is probably usually best. You just put it in, and it pops in whenever there's a due date, and it pops an email to whoever is assigned to that recommendation. But if you don't, an Excel sheet works just as fine. It just requires that there is a central responsible person that will track the assigned recommendation and make sure that they're closed out. Now, this is what a common recommendation action tracking log looks like. Now, this includes any PHA recommendation, compliance audit recommendation, and seismic assessment recommendation. It's a good idea to just put everything in one sheet that is a central tracking system for your whole PSM, RMP, OSHA gives you the following guidance for process hazard analysis finding. You can justify to decline to adopt a recommendation if you can document in writing and adequate evidence that that one of these things is true. That there's factual errors in the analysis done for the recommendation. The recommendation is not necessary to protect the health and safety of the employees. So if you have something that's their recommendation to protect assets or the environment, if you document that it will not affect the health and safety, you can decide not to adopt that recommendation. If you have an alternative measure other than what the recommendation is stating that will provide a sufficient level of protection, or if the recommendation is infeasible in the grand scheme of things. Now, I want to go back to the tips for streamlining audits. Kind of go over what are some things that take the most time in a compliance audit and what you can do to effectively reduce the time suck, as per se. Now, there's a common theme to this, and this is common in the PSM guidance, is just pick a sample size, P&ID check, pick a vessel with associated piping, and just walk down that part of the system. If you find any deficiencies in that part of the system, the chances are that you have other deficiencies throughout your whole system. Mechanical integrity check. Pick the same piece of equipment that you walk down. Find all the mechanical integrity elements over the last 5 years. Review those records, review them against a centralized requirement for PMs, make sure that everything has been done. You assume that that is representative of your whole system. Training, you choose an employee at random and you check their training records and make sure, now the important thing here is to make sure that there have been methods to verify that training has been is effective. So any quiz that you use, any kind of questionnaire, it's important that you retain records for those. Operating procedures. Pick a procedure at random. Once again, it's the same thing over and over again. And then you assume that if that operating procedure is compliant, all your operating procedures are compliant. A lot of the time, operating procedures even have common elements that if it's wrong in one place, it's going to be wrong in all of them at the same place. I'm not saying that's always the case. Sometimes there's specific parts about the operating procedures that are wrong, but oftentimes you can find common elements around all operating procedures that are faulty. And then PSR MOC, make sure if there's a master tracker for MOC, just throw a coin, find an MOC, review it, make sure that it's been done properly, and assume that the MOCs and PSSRs have been done compliant across the board. If not, then you make a recommendation to verify all PSSRs and MOCs to make sure that they're compliant. Now, recommended schedule. This is based on our experience. The best things to start with are first the P&IDs, which are part of the PSI. You walk down the PSI to make sure to find out what the status of the system is. You get a good overview of the system, then you go through the PSI and make sure that everything has been updated as required, and then you go down the operating procedures and mechanical integrity documentation. These three elements will probably take 75% of your time, 75 to 80% of your time to review from the whole compliance audit. They're the largest element and take the most. As I've mentioned before, it's a living program. This is the heart and soul of your PSM program. Walk down. You interview operators to verify the operating procedures, verify representative P&IDs, verify mechanical integrity records. After that, you just review other prevention program elements, training, employee participation, PHAs, MOCs, PSRs, and so on and so forth. Now, let's go over some interview techniques and tips. Uh, it's you just when you talk to an operator about an operating procedure, just have the operator just show you what they do on the field, um, and then follow along with the operating procedure. You don't have to do it in a conference room. It's actually a lot easier if you just go out there and then have them show you, okay, this is the valve that I open. This is what I do before I open this valve. This is how I start up this vessel. This is how I start up this system. And you just follow along with the operating procedure. Employee participation. Just ask operators what they know and how they're involved in the RMP PSM program. Um, That's a very simple question: is do they know where the CalArp RMP PSM binder is? Have they been informed of where they can find it? Have they been informed of who they can ask regarding the RMP PSM program? Incident investigation. Do they feel they've been adequately trained on past incidents that have occurred in the facility? And then the emergency action plan, emergency response plan. Do they know if you have one? And how do they respond in an emergency? Do they know how to respond in an emergency? Do they have an assembly point, and who do they report to in the case of an emergency? They're all very good questions to ask for an EAP ERP questionnaire. Now, some things to remember. Even if the facility performs all of the actions of their recommendations, if the documentation that originally stated the recommendation is not updated, it is a deficiency. I've mentioned this multiple times throughout this presentation. If you don't have closure comments on recommendations, it is a deficiency. Now, the reason why I've gone over this so many times, it is probably the most common deficiency I see in any program across the board. It's very easy to fix, not a hard fix. Now, the life cycle of a prevention program. I've mentioned this again multiple times. These are living documents. Deficiencies occur. I've never been to a facility and not found a deficiency. It's normal. People, you will never have a perfect program, but you want to strive to have as perfect a program as possible. You develop the program, you implement it, follow the procedure, you evaluate through the compliance audit, and you improve the program. That's what the compliance audits are there for. That's why you have them. It's a living program, and you need to update it as you go. Now, so compliance audit review. What are some important points about compliance audit? You must have the appropriate team. People with the respective knowledge regarding the different program elements need to be there. Like I said, you don't have to be there the whole time during a compliance audit, but they need to be involved at some aspect in some form. Have a method to document the result. A simple checklist will work. Ensure that the regulatory requirements are met. Have the checklist follow the regulatory requirements and make sure that they've been met. Review any supporting documentation. So any training records, mechanical integrity records, any operating procedure reviews. Look for program implementations. And then be objective. Now, this is very important to be objective. You don't want to think, hey, I have a deficiency, but I'm going to fix it next week, so I don't have to make a recommendation for this. If you have a deficiency, document that deficiency. Or if you think, oh, this will get fixed eventually, I don't have to make a recommendation. It's just going to have to be something that I follow through. You can't be sure that that will get implemented in time. Make recommendations, be objective, and follow up on those recommendations. Make sure that they have closure comments. Now, the one thing I want to talk about again is the EPA's enforcement push. Now, this is very important. If the EPA comes, they're not going to have one person for a compliance audit like you do for internal compliance audit. They're going to have 3 or 4 people, and they're going to be there for a week. They're going to take apart your whole program. They're going to want to look at everything. It's very important that any compliance audit you do is very effective and very efficient in finding any deficiencies that you have in your program. chances are over the next 3 years, your facility will get visited by the EPA. Um, this is something new that the EPA is implementing over the next 3 years. So it's very interesting to see what will happen in the next few years. Now we have some other upcoming webinars, September 27th, 28th. If you're local in California, myself and Michael Sora will be speaking on the changes to the PSM RMP modernization programs in California. October 4th and 7th, we will be at the 2016 Region National Conference if you're involved in the refrigeration field. And on October 11th, we'll have a security vulnerability assessments, SVAs for the Contra Costa County and other applications. And I'll ask Morgan to come up here to join me, and if there are any questions, please let us know.
Okay, we have one question from the audience. How do you justify that auditing one procedure, one equipment sample, one P&ID provides an adequate audit to assure PSM RMP programs are effective?
Now, once again, this goes back to the question of probability and statistics. You assume that you pick a sample size, normally 10 to 25% of your whole program, depending on how big your program is sufficient. You assume that, based on statistics, that if that operating procedure is compliant, then the majority of your other operating procedures are also compliant. Now, there may be a procedure that is not compliant. That is true. You can't be sure, 100% sure that if you verify one, that all of them are not compliant. But the amount of by statistically, if the amount of the amount of compliance, the amount that you would be out of compliance would be very low compared to what based on what that one procedure you viewed was. If you're really out of compliance, it will show throughout all your procedures, not just one.
And again, this is just advice to help streamline the compliance audit interviewing process. When you're going through all the elements, if you have the time and resources and want to dive in deeper and look at more elements, we're not saying just to focus on a couple of representative ones. That's just for time's sake. So that's up to the auditor at the time.
Our question is, if your 3-year audit was due in 2014, but we're late and had it in 2015, when is the next audit due? Does the audit time reset to 2015, making the next audit due date in 2018, or would the audit be due in 2017 using the missed 2014 due date?
Morgan, you want to take this?
Yes. So audits have to be done every 3 years. If you missed it, then from 2015, the next one would be in 2018.
That is correct. Okay, we don't have any more questions. Thank you very much. If you have any other, there is one more question.
Okay, we had another question come through. What is the written plan for employee participation? What does it entail?
Employee participation is pretty much just a means of getting the employees as involved in the process as possible. So having them present in the PHA, the process hazard analysis, having them aware of the program documentation, its location, the safety information within it, the mechanical integrity information within it, having them involved obviously with training, just so they're aware of each of the elements and having them involved in the program as possible.
In the past, what we have done for employee participation programs is just do a little small paragraph about how employees are involved with each implementation program. So if you have employees involved in the PHA, you include employees, you kind of explain how employees are involved in the PHA. If they're trained on incident investigation, explain how they're trained on incident investigation, what happens. Same thing for MOCs and PSSRs. Also, if you have regular training on PSM, MOC, PSM, RMP, and CalARP, it's also good to include that a little blurb about what that training includes in the employee participation written plan. All right, thank you very much. If you have any other question, you can email them at producer@rmpcorp.com or any of the email addresses seen on the screen right here, myself or Morgan McVey. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next webinar.